thank you all for doing that, and I hope that is the start of some collisions, and everybody, tonight we're going to try to get everyone lubricated, and you'll remember something you heard today, and you'll run up and make a connection, and we hope it will be useful to all. Now it's absolutely my honor to introduce our first real speaker. I'm an amateur. This is a professional I'm getting ready to introduce. Ross DeVol, for any of us who are amateur data nerds as well, have looked at the work that Ross DeVol has done and been really happy he's doing what he's doing, because it's important work. Ross is President and CEO of Heartland Forward and a fellow at the Walton Family Foundation. Heartland Forward's goal is to promote regional innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystems that foster job creation, wage gains, and economic growth for the American heartland. Heartland Forward would pursue its mission through independent, data-driven research, action-oriented convenings such as the Heartland Summit, and impactful policy recommendations. Heartland Forward works with universities, colleges, the business community, public policy leaders, and philanthropy to analyze resources supporting the startup community and identify workforce and talent gaps. DeVol is a former chief research officer for the Milken Institute, where he spent nearly 20 years as an economic think tank headquartered in California. He oversaw research on international, national, and comparative regional growth performance, access to capital, and its role in economic growth and job creation, and health-related topics. He has been ranked among the superstars of think tank scholars by International Economy magazine. Join me in welcoming Ross DeVol.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish I could spend the whole afternoon with you, but the Clintons asked me to stop by the Clinton Library tomorrow to make some remarks on an economic development conference there. And one thing I learned over the years: never turn down former presidents when they ask you to do something. It's probably not in your best interest to do so. So what I'm going to do today is share some research that I've undertaken for the last multiple years. I won't tell you how many. But we launched Heartland Forward just back in October, and we're headquartered in Bentonville, Arkansas. Yes, that's the home of Walmart and the Crystal Bridges American Museum of Art. And this organization was spun out of the Walton Family Foundation. I am no longer officially a fellow at the Walton Family Foundation since we've started Heartland Forward. We're focused on trying to improve economic performance in the center of the country, the 20 states that we determined are the heartland. And what I'm going to do today is really try and focus on the changing dynamics of economic growth across the country, and then give you particular emphasis on smaller communities, as we call them, micropolitans. So just an overview, I'm going to try and cover innovation and long-term growth. Many of the same factors that affect national economic performance over the long term affect regions' ability to grow. Then I'll focus a little bit on using the State Technology and Science Index that I developed while at the Milken Institute. And it really looks at a comprehensive inventory of the technology and science assets of places and how they can be leveraged to promote economic growth. And then I'll share with you some very brief research that's part of a much longer research project on the role of higher education and knowledge creation in economic development, mainly the infographic summaries of those. And then I'm going to spend more time giving you a preview of forthcoming research on the role of young firms and the ability to scale them up in terms of future job creation in places all across the country. And then I will drill down and spend a little bit of time and talk about some successful micropolitan communities that have different characteristics, just to give you a sense of what different places are doing. And then I'll conclude by just giving you kind of my headline version of lessons for micropolitans. So many of the same factors that affect national long-term economic growth also affect the potential growth of regions around the country. But national economic long-term growth has more rigid constraints placed upon it than places. For example, labor is highly mobile across the United States. As individuals and firms respond to differences in relative economic performance factors, they migrate, and those migration trends between regions can greatly affect the long-term growth potential of places. And if you really want to understand the differences in regional growth patterns across the country, you must understand that there are few barriers to the flow of economic activity across borders. Regions openly and actively compete for new and expanding businesses. And regions are heavily dependent upon those industries that produce goods and services for sale beyond their borders. So it's an export, meaning that more is produced locally than is consumed, and that more people outside the area are consuming it. But obviously, manufacturing can be an export industry, but also industries such as healthcare services, medical science can be an export industry. And it's really this output that's generated by having greater production locally than is consumed that forms kind of the economic base of a regional economy. It provides a stimuli to the local economy, circulating, multiplying, and affecting wages and economic activity much more broadly than that. A quick review of some of the factors that affect regional disparity over the long term. Well, each region inherits its industrial structure, and it can affect growth for a number of years into the future. The tax structure of capital and labor really influences whether states and places retain their existing industries, firms, and people, and whether they attract new investment for expansion. The factors that determine disparities in regional growth, the cost of doing business still matters. You know, such things as tax rates, capital costs, wage rates, space costs, healthcare costs, more of the traditional costs of doing business. But today, other factors play an even more important role. Labor force skills, access to markets, and access to capital. You also see research, development, innovation, and entrepreneurial capacities playing an increasingly important role today across the country. Universities and colleges committed to tech transfer and creating human capital are really essential to promoting economic growth. And I would also include community colleges in terms of creating that human capital. And last, we cannot rule out an important factor, the quality of place issues. And I'll discuss that in more detail. But all these factors interact profoundly and determine kind of the self-reinforcing mechanisms of sustaining economic growth. This chart tries to look at research and development spending in the United States by source, just to give you kind of the raw materials of knowledge-based economic growth. The research and development really forms the intellectual property that can be commercialized for future economic success, either in an existing enterprise or in a startup firm. And the primary sources of R&D are the federal government, universities conduct a lot of R&D, and private industry. Federal funding of R&D is principally directed towards basic science and medical research. However, it forms the basis of subsequent applied research and development that has commercial applicability. Corporations are providing more funding for universities for applied work, and still the basic principal source of funding for universities is the federal government. Industry invests roughly 60 to 65% of R&D in the United States, and many large U.S. corporations are among the most innovative in the world. The Googles, the Intels, you go down the list, the Apples, and they are at the forefront of R&D. However, a distinguishing feature for the United States business environment is that we have many smaller R&D intensive firms that create the next generation of products that transform things. That is where our future lies. Now, there will be a series of maps, so some of these are probably hard for you to see in the back, but try and locate your state, if you will. So if you're in dark blue, it means you're in the top 10. If you're in light gray or light blue, it means you're in the bottom 10 on a per capita basis or normalized by some measure. So this looks at the R&D inputs, which can result in economic activity. But because knowledge is generated, transmitted, and shared more efficiently in close geographic proximity, economic activity based on new knowledge has a high proclivity to concentrate or cluster in a geographic area. And if you want to build a new industry cluster, the research and development and innovation capacities are absolutely essential. Universities are a key component of that. So there's about 18 different measures of R&D. Many of them I showed you in that previous slide: federal, university, industry R&D, but many others. So it looks at funding from the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Small Business Innovation Research Awards, a number of different measures, and they're all normalized on a per capita basis. And here you see I have Michigan at 12th. That was the highest among the heartland states, 20 in the center of the country. You can see your states, and once again, state level attempts to muddy things out a bit, but I will show you some micropolitan measures here as well. Entrepreneurs are absolutely critical in the early stage financing that supports the process of company formation and growth. They're critical not only to the nation, but to every region around the country to maintain a pace of growth that fosters job creation for its people. This measure is the percent of U.S. employment at young firms. So that's firms 5 years of age or less as a share of total employment across the country. And you can see that that has fallen quite precipitously, especially since the Great Recession. It had already been declining. It appears that it's kind of bottomed out at this point, but the entrepreneurial activity and capacity is really essential. You must provide the training and support coming from both the private sector and the public sector because you have to be able to recognize the entrepreneurial opportunities but have the capacity to exploit them. That will increase the level of startup efforts, new firm birth, and scale-ups, and ultimately job formation. As I mentioned, it appears that this has bottomed out, but it's premature to conclude that it absolutely has. We're still speculating some of the reasons behind that. Part of it is if you look at millennial generation and their rates of entrepreneurship at the same age as baby boomers, it's roughly half. And so one of the factors that people are looking at is student debt. Many millennials have high levels of student debt. It makes it harder for them to kind of bootstrap on their own because that student debt is the first lien. You cannot release it. And so that's one area that we're looking at. Also, you're seeing large firms maintain their dominance in many, especially technology industries, much longer. So think of the Googles and Apples that maintain their position much longer, and there's many other firms. So you combine that with lower rates of initial public offering. More exits are done through mergers and acquisition, which in many cases are larger firms bringing in younger firms, in some cases adopting that technology, but also many times precluding future competitors. And that's probably one of the reasons why this has declined. And I believe it does explain a lot of the lost dynamicism of the overall U.S. economy. This is the risk capital entrepreneurial infrastructure component. There are about, I think, 10 components of this. Once again, dark blue, you're in the top 10. Light blue, you're in the bottom 10. And I think we need a new conceptual framework for regional economic growth that explicitly recognizes the role of entrepreneurship and the early stage risk capital that's required to promote those firms. So it's not just about venture capital, angel investing, but it's about the smart money, the mentorships that are available, the networks that form as a result of that. In the heartland, Illinois was highest at 10th. You can find your state here. North Carolina is certainly in the top 10 on that measure. But the heartland does have some other states in the top tier: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio. But it really is about kind of building the entrepreneurial awareness and the capacity to execute technology-based economic development. And scaling up university research so that it can find its way into the private sector. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of human capital. This shows you the percent of the adult population, age 25 and above, that have a bachelor's degree or higher. This is the most important form of intellectual property a nation could have, and it's really the accumulation of skills that have been built up over many decades, kind of the stock of human capital. You can see that the percent of the adult population in the United States that has a bachelor's degree or above has risen from about 11% in 1970 to roughly 34, almost 35% today. It's one area that we have still been making significant investments and advances. And human capital isn't just about the returns to the individual, but the returns to firms as well. Businesses that invest in human capital exhibit superior performance in terms of sales growth, market share, capital investment, productivity, and a range of other measures. This is the human capital investment component of the overall State Technology and Science Index. There are 20 different indicators, and I have to explain this. I'm an economist by training, so bear with me a moment. It has both stock measures. So a stock measure would be the percent of the adult population with a bachelor's degree or above. That's a stock at any one point in time. That's about 2/3 of these measures. 1/3 of them are what I would call flow measures, or rates of change in recent years. It looks at normalized relative to the population aged 25 to 34. So it lets you see which states are making improvements in that category. And it includes a lot of different science and technology areas. So places must utilize the knowledge assets in their midst: research universities, other research centers, and more importantly, the talent that they create. Now, in the heartland, Minnesota is tops at 4th in the country. You can see that Virginia scores very well on there. North Carolina kind of in that second tier. Illinois also had a top 10 placement in the heartland, but places that are not, that are in the light gray, especially here, need to invest more in human capital. Now, it's not just 4-year degrees or above. This is also community colleges when you're looking at this, especially in the different technology and science fields today. The intensity of the technology and science workforce indicates whether the U.S. has adequate reservoirs of technical talent. And if you're going to conduct R&D, it can only be done by the scientific and technical talent and converted to a commercially viable enterprise. And despite representing less than 5% of all jobs, these technology and science workers are critical components of a region's ability to grow over the long term. STEM workers' share of the U.S. workforce have risen from less than 2% in 1960 to, as I said, 5% today, and they now represent 6.3 million workers. So this takes a group of those technology and science occupations and groups them together. It includes both the life sciences, it includes computer sciences, IT, a broad range of technology and science. So it's really looking at the concentration of those technology and science workers. And here we include just by occupation. So you don't necessarily have to have a degree in this occupation as long as you're practicing in it. But most people do have a degree in these occupations. So once again, in the heartland, you see Minnesota scores in the top 10 at 7th. Virginia is in the top 10 as well. And you're really talking about the talent, those geographically discriminating assets that can move to wherever the best opportunities are present. This looks at what we call 50 different advanced industries, both manufacturing and services, that are absolutely critical. They conduct the most private sector R&D. So advanced manufacturing sectors would include motor vehicles, aerospace, medical devices, biopharmaceuticals, and these are at the vanguard of knowledge-intensive manufacturing. However, the productivity rate or the efficiency within these industries has been such that they're not the net highest job generators. It's really the advanced services that are generating the most jobs. So we're talking about digital technologies such as information processing, AI, web design, scientific research, data sciences, among others. And these are really accounting for the majority of the growth in high-paying jobs in the United States. Since 2010, at the end of the Great Recession, there have been 2 million jobs created in advanced services in the United States. This is one of my favorite snapshot charts, I call it. It looks at those advanced industries. They account for just less than 9% of overall U.S. employment, but over 17% of GDP, so double the proportion in GDP as to employment. They account for 60% of U.S. exports by value. They hire 80% of U.S. engineers. They account for over 81% of all patents generated in the United States, and nearly 90% of overall private sector R&D. This is kind of an outcome measure that looks at all those other inputs in the State Technology and Science Index. So it looks at high-tech employment, payroll activity, new business formations and growth in those technology sectors. And it tries to really look at the technology management capabilities that are resident in regions. In some sense, it's a measure of outcomes, both government, the private sector, what has grown and what exists on the ground. You see Texas was 10th overall, the highest scoring heartland state. But you have Virginia, North Carolina, and even Georgia in the top 10 now. And unfortunately for the heartland, we have 7 of the bottom 10 states in terms of technology concentration and dynamicism. And more must be done there, and it's a key reason why our new organization, Heartland Forward, exists today. So if you put all those measures together, there were 5 composites, and there are 107 individual indicators that lie beneath all those figures. You come up with the State Technology and Science Index. Massachusetts has been number 1 since we started creating this index back in 2002 when I was at the Milken Institute. But as I always had to point out amongst my colleagues, former colleagues in California, if you were to carve out coastal California, it would be number 1 by far. You're basically comparing the Boston-Cambridge area to a huge state such as California. But you'll also see other states there, and actually Colorado in deep blue is 2nd on a per capita basis. And the most rapidly improving state over the past decade has been the state of Utah, which is 5th. And I have a whole nother presentation on that, just on what Utah has done. But you do see the divergence that's largely occurred between most of the coastal United States and the center of the country. There's an opportunity, though, because more technology firms and workers are searching for more business-friendly locations with lower costs of doing business, fewer restrictive regulations, and perhaps more importantly, more affordable housing options. So for example, in San Francisco today, a 2-bedroom, 1,200 square foot apartment that you might want your kids to live in goes for about $6,000 a month in rent. And if it's in a better district, it's $7,000. So if you're not going to be in the money or have options to cash in the next few years, it doesn't make much economic sense for you to stay there. And more are looking to locate to other places. Now, a lot of people have said to me over the years, Ross, you show all these maps showing that you were an undergraduate geography major, in addition to being an economist, but what does it really mean? What evidence can you demonstrate that it makes a difference? All right, so this is a bit of a busy chart, but it shows you the actual average annual pay across the 50 states in the blue bar versus what it's called the predicted line there in that yellow. So if you're trying to explain differences in average annual pay and you use the State Technology and Science Index, you can predict, explain, if you will, 75% of the overall variation in average annual pay across those states. So there clearly is a relationship. I would infer that it's causal, not just correlation. Somebody's banging away. They must not. Anything I said has been heresy. I'm not sure. Anyhow, let's quickly go to a matter of degrees. This is a study that I did while at the Milken Institute with my colleagues. Really looked at the effect of educational attainment on regional economic prosperity, and it tries to put specific numbers to it. Its goal was to inform policymakers, educators, business executives, and others about the importance of investing in human capital. To make a long story short, this was almost a year-long project. It required putting together 5 different data sets that the federal government did not tie together, the BEA, the BLS, and a whole range of others, Census Bureau. We were trying to look at how much does educational attainment matter to economic growth, economic development. And so we held a lot of other factors constant. And really, the importance of human capital can be boiled down into this infographic. So it looks at just the effect of an additional year of education. So adding 1 year of post-secondary education beyond high school among employed workers with at least a high school diploma is associated with an increase in GDP per capita of over 17%, and also in terms of real wages per worker. Well, that's not just for people with advanced degrees, bachelor's degrees. It's for everyone in those communities that their income levels rise. Concentrating human capital has many positive spillover effects. Oops, sorry, go back one. There we go. Now, this is going to be really hard to see in the back. I'm more than willing to share these slides with folks, and we'll do that. So now I'm going to switch to some work on micropolitans. This shows you the share of total employment at young firms. Once again, firms 5 years of age or less. And we were developing our most dynamic micropolitans index. I wanted to include some forward-looking measures of job creation and overall economic growth. So the darker the blue dot here, the higher the proportion of employment that's at young firms. And the Census Bureau created a data set about 5 years ago and began publicizing it. It's a long name, the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Data Set. And it contains new information on entrepreneurship that allow us to examine questions that regional economic researchers have been proposing for years, trying to find out what the truth is, but not really having the specific data that's required to do so. This has information by county across the entire United States. There's 32 different economic indicators, including employment, job creation, destruction, wages, other measures of employment flows. And it has firm characteristics by those geographies, industry, age, worker characteristics such as age, sex, educational attainment, many other measures. And so I believe that the young firm share of total employment was a good indicator of forward job creation. And you can see that there's a lot of dark blue dots in the Pacific Northwest, in the Intermountain West. You'll see many in Texas and in Florida as well. There's some scattered along the East Coast. But there's a lot of lighter blue dots in more rural areas of the country, which they're by micropolitan. But there clearly is something going on here. So what we did, and we haven't yet written this up, Richard Florida, he of the creative classes, is a senior fellow at Heartland Forward, and we've done work together collaborating for, let's just say, multiple decades, and we'll leave it at that. But we wanted to test the importance of young firms and their knowledge intensiveness in explaining future economic growth. Now, how do I measure the knowledge intensiveness? So as I said, that data set allowed us to calculate the percent of employment at young firms, or the percent of employees at young firms that have a bachelor's degree or above. So you have kind of the broader measures of the entrepreneurial ecosystem represented by the share of total employment at young firms, and then the knowledge intensiveness as measured by the percent of employees at young firms with a bachelor's degree or above. So this gives you a sense of founders that are trying to scale up to tap regional, national markets. It's not just kind of family-based entrepreneurship. That's important, creates jobs, but these are firms that are looking to grow and scale up and have future economic impact. So we used the shares in 2010. Just going to get a little technical here. So if you take the shares, the young firm share in 2010, its knowledge intensiveness, the percent of employees at young firm with a bachelor's degree or above in 2010, we controlled for a whole host of other factors, and we used it to explain employment growth amongst all micropolitans across the country from 2010 to 2017. So when you do that, even at the micropolitan level, you can explain over 1/3 of the difference in job growth in the future just based on those kind of measures of the regional entrepreneurial ecosystems around the country. And that is really a fairly significant finding. Another way to look at it is if you take where you would have predicted job growth to have been by 2017 based on those measures in 2010, this shows you how well it predicts those outcomes, adjusting for many other factors. So this is a high level of predictive power, and both of those coefficients are highly significant, much more significant than I thought they would be, to be quite honest. I figured this relationship would work at the metropolitan level fairly well, but it actually is even more significant at the micropolitan level. So this is another infographic. You have to be able to try to boil things down in infographics, but this one gets a bit complicated, so bear with me as I try and explain this. So the young firm's share of total employment is a measure of the depth and breadth of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, or its entrepreneurial capital, if you will. Most studies have focused on kind of self-employed and explaining differences in economic performance. But there's really a dearth of evidence of the importance of young firms as opposed to small firms. There has been a lot in the nomenclature about small firms create the most jobs. That's not really correct. It's young firms that create the most jobs, not small firms. These are firms that are trying to scale up. They're attacking markets. I think that many economic development officials have been using incentive policies focused on recruitment, what I might call smokestack chasing. I'm not saying that shouldn't be part of the portfolio, but smaller communities have spent too much time focusing on that. They're not utilizing the resources for economic development efficiently, as this data and others will show. The answer is grow your own firms, less of them will leave. Now, if we just zero in on the knowledge intensiveness in its separate effect, these are, once again, companies whose intention is to scale up and employ 150 to 250 people in the future. Young firms tend to be more innovative, and this gives you a sense of the knowledge intensity. So after a decade, if you just increase the share or the percent of employees at young firms that have a bachelor's degree or above by 3.2 percentage points. Now that's one standard deviation unit. That will result in 2.6 percentage points higher growth. So over that entire period from 2010 to 2017, that results in 34% faster job growth. Just increasing the young firm share, or I should say its knowledge intensiveness, by one standard deviation unit, or 3.2 percentage points. That's not a huge amount, but it has a tremendous bearing on future job creation. This is a fairly busy chart, but someone asked me to create a regional entrepreneurial ecosystem in one slide, and so I've attempted to do that. It's better if you have a hard copy in your possession, but it goes from around the edges, knowledge creation, to technology transfer, to commercialization and clusters. Note that I put the entrepreneur in the middle of that, and firm growth, and the importance of universities and research institutions. Because it is increasingly important to innovate, start and grow new firms, to diversify the local economic ecosystem, because many large firms will ultimately stagnate. You can look to upper state New York and many other places that were once one company towns. I come from a similar town called Lancaster, Ohio, that was the headquarters of Anchor Hocking, and it was a one company town, a one industry town, and unfortunately for that community, Anchor Hocking, through a series of missteps, did not do very well, international competition, but today it just has one factory left in that community, and it lost an anchor. So the point being, if a community does not focus on entrepreneurship, it's not creating the next generation of firms, and as outside influences hit you, you tend to not be as resilient. All right, let me spend just a little bit of time on our most dynamic micropolitan index that I created after coming over to start Heartland Forward. There are 551 micropolitan areas included in this measure. It tries to provide an objective measure of the economic vibrancy of smaller communities. So it has that young firm employment ratio. It has per capita income. It looks at kind of medium-term job growth, recent job growth. It looks at personal income growth in the medium term and short term. It's kind of give you a snapshot of how communities are doing. And we put that all together and created rankings of all 551 micropolitan areas. So what I wanted to do was just run you through kind of 4 examples of what different communities are doing in different buckets. And the first one is Heber, Utah, located in the Wasatch Outback, along with Summit Park, Utah. It's a very short commute, 25-minute commute to Provo-Orem, 45 to an hour commute to Salt Lake City. Its population has doubled in just over a decade. And in 2016 alone, its population growth was 4.6% in 1 year. That ranks 3rd among all U.S. counties. It's benefited by its proximity to both Provo-Orem and to Salt Lake City. Housing prices are much lower, so it's taking advantage of that, and a higher quality of life. It's not as dependent on travel and tourism as many other kind of mountain recreational centers are, but travel and tourism accounts for about 22% of its economy. Snowbird Mountain there, it's a world-class ski resort, but it's been diversifying its economy by providing entrepreneurial support and mentoring through its Small Business Development Center at Utah Valley University in its Business Resource Center. Median family income in this county is about $71,000, and there has been a very rapid gain in professional and technical services employment in this community in recent years. It has targeted software development, information technology, professional services, healthcare services, and other medical services, along at advanced manufacturing. This shows you employment growth over the past few years, and you can just see how rapid that has been. Another community located in the Intermountain West, Bozeman, Montana. It was fifth in most dynamic micropolitans when we did that earlier this year. It is among the top tourism dependent destinations in the nation, with the Yellowstone National Park to its immediate south. But Bozeman has a highly diverse economy with many more elements than travel and tourism. And really its industrial composition resembles more of a metropolitan than a micropolitan. Bozeman has a thriving photonics optics cluster, a substantial software and information processing presence, a bioscience sector, as well as a major healthcare service operation. It also specializes in outdoor recreational product design and manufacturing that many of its skiing enthusiasts enjoy. And Montana State University has been churning out more graduates and conducting more research with the aim of spinning out companies and providing the entrepreneurial training to students and faculty. And it has been one of the most successful universities in a micropolitan area in translating research into commercial impact. Job creation was 12th overall during this period in the United States, and most of these are very high-paying jobs that are being created. Findlay, Ohio. I was not born in Lancaster, but born in Mount Vernon, Ohio. So I have my origins there. Many communities around Findlay are not doing as well as Findlay has been doing. It was second among the heartland micropolitans in our study, and it has been ranked the top micropolitan community for 3 years in a row by Site Selection magazine for expansions. It was first in personal income growth in 2016 and fifth on this measure overall since 2011. There's a high degree of cooperation between local businesses, government, and nonprofit organizations in creating an environment conducive to company location and expansion. Economic development officials pay very close attention to the business climate for retention and recruitment, its regulatory and tax policies, its technical assistance and strategies for workforce development. And manufacturing is a key component of Findlay's economic base, representing over 22% of total employment. And remarkably, as communities around it have seen a decline in the manufacturing share of total employment, its share has roughly stayed constant since around 2000. The University of Findlay is a critical component of the region's ecosystem. It's a progressive college that continually seeks out new ways to serve its students and community, and the school is consistently adjusting its classroom curriculum to reflect the views and requirements of the local employers. And those local employers serve on its curriculum review boards and committees, and they're constantly adjusting and updating the curriculum. Another example, Lewisburg, Tennessee, was in the top 20 in our most dynamic micropolitans. It's one of the few that is not either attached to oil and gas, natural gas production, or kind of amenity-centered travel and tourism. It's roughly halfway between Nashville, Tennessee, and Huntsville, Alabama, and it's really been reaching out to attract manufacturing facilities. The local economic development development agency has been advertising itself to manufacturers. Web page that has all kinds of information on programs that are available. And this self-branding seems to have done the job. It's in a strategic location, but it really has been benefiting by advertising itself and what it can do. All right, so There's a lot, a separate entire presentation on what could micropolitans do, but based on my research, let me give you some kind of top line things that you want to consider, and many of which I'm sure you're already doing. If you look across the most dynamic micropolitans, you see travel and tourism locations have done very well. The amenities, if you have some of those, you should consider promoting them. But communities with clusters of professional, scientific, and technical services serve as important anchors. They create jobs that have high wages and have strong spillovers. Advanced manufacturing has been a positive factor over this period of time. You know, automotive, machine tools, other capital goods. But improvements in high-end human capital are absolutely necessary, but it also must start with K through 12 education, because you must educate parents on the changing dynamics of what jobs are in demand in the future. And we must develop a passion for science and technology at a very early age. Micropolitans with universities and four-year degree colleges witness superior economic growth, holding other factors constant. They've been not only creating human capital and retaining it, but also in many cases commercializing research that's done there. Encouraging career technical education, we used to call that vocational education before we made that a dirty word, and told parents you should not let your children grow up to go into vocational education. That was a huge mistake in my estimation. So today we need to rebrand that as career technical education, because they are middle class jobs. So these are welders, these are precision machine tools, a whole range of different areas. Many of these jobs pay $70,000 to $80,000 a year, and they're going wanting because we don't have young people who are trained to fill them. So community colleges who are actively engaged in the training needs of local businesses that interact with them on a regular basis, they do much better over the long term. Also, building entrepreneurial capacities, as I've discussed earlier. In an area of rapid technological change, entrepreneurs play a vital role because the new enterprises they form are not encumbered by past institutional biases or personal biases. They are better positioned to envision new ways to combine existing technologies with new discoveries and bring new products and services to the marketplace. And once initiated, there's a startup and spin-off process that creates a virtuous, self-reinforcing progression that really nurtures and aids the entrepreneurial efforts over the long term. Micropolitan areas that support entrepreneurs and small businesses are more dynamic and resilient in the face of economic change. And you can see this when you look across the data. Encouraging angel capital investment pools, regional supported seed financing funds, and saleable tax credits can work in a lot of communities. But as firms try to attract and retain top-level managers, scientists, engineers, other technicians, and members of the creative class, quality of place is absolutely essential to success. Arts, entertainment, recreational amenities, other lifestyle amenities and cultural attributes, access to health care, good quality health care, K through 12 education, transportation mobility, crime rates, air quality, a whole range of these factors increasingly affect location decisions. Successful places use a portfolio approach to economic development with a foundation of recruiting, indigenous expansion, and entrepreneurship. You need to award incentives on the basis of economic impact, not just on the number of jobs, but with the jobs associated, with the wages associated with those jobs. And communities need to look deeply into their long-term situation. You cannot analyze the economy like you would the weather. You have to examine it with a critical detachment and a sense of evolving vision for the future. A kind of long-range shared vision is now necessary. There needs to be a strategic blueprint that guides the tactical implementation efforts. So in closing, I would say that innovation and entrepreneurship are critical components of how places can create jobs and vitality, but also sustaining the U.S. economy overall. Many demographers like to say that demography is destiny, and I believe that creating your own firms determines your destiny because you will be more resilient. So I appreciate your patience in covering many of those factors, and I will be around through lunch, and I hope to have an opportunity to chat with many of you. Thank you.
Thank you again, Ross. That was great, and we really appreciate that. It was a great start to our event. I see a couple new faces in here, and we got a few minutes while we're waiting on lunch. So I'm going to run around with the mic real quick and ask all of you who've just showed up to raise your hands and introduce yourself to the group. We're just talking. Tell us where you're from and who you're representing today. You didn't go, Linda.
I didn't just arrive, but I think I was in no man's land when we had introductions earlier. My name's Linda Hoke, and I'm here in two roles. I serve as the director of the Consortium of University Public Service Organizations, and these are institutes and centers like the School of Government at UNC Chapel Hill and the Institute for Emerging Issues at North Carolina State that provide policy research, technical assistance, and training. These are centers that are located across the United States. So I'm interested in that role because our institutes and centers are working with communities around the country, interested in hearing lessons and what you're all working on in that respect. And then in my other role, I am working as part of the economic leadership team. This is my third year to attend the conference, and my role is, as you can see, I'm diligently taking notes up here. So I'm kind of the recorder for the event. So I'll be listening a lot to what you're talking about and lessons that we can then distill from the event and share in terms of a report that you and others will hopefully learn from in the future. So thanks.
If you haven't had a chance, go to our website and look at the notes from the 2 previous years, and Linda puts all those together, and she's absolutely awesome in that role.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Palmer. I won't speak too much because I'm on a panel later on this afternoon, but I'm the Senior Engagement Director at Self-Help. It's a CDFI, which you'll hear, or 2 of us that's going to present later on today, so you'll hear more about us then.
Hey, I'm Michael Goodman with Capital Broadcasting Company here from Durham, and similarly, you'll hear from me up there, so I won't take too much air out of the room.
Anyone else new to the show? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Kimberly Van Dyke. I work with the City of Wilson, the Director of Planning and Community Revitalization, and my department does a lot of long-range planning, downtown development, community development, center city revitalization work.
Thank you very much. So next, we're going to eat. And so if you're new here, we always try to feed you well, and we are, however, going to have a working lunch, and so we're going to challenge you during lunch to reflect on the presentation that Ross has presented to us, and think about within your communities or the communities with which you're working, what is working there, maybe around entrepreneurship and creating a dynamic ecosystem. And what are you still struggling with, and what can you take away from this presentation to help out your communities? Because that's really what we're here for. So at this point, we're going to break for lunch. I think the caterers are going to come down and invite us up by table. So if you'll stay seated till you're invited up, and then we'll have a good lunch, and then the program will proceed. Thanks.